Now, you moved to Australia around 20 years ago, um,
Yes,
and this was at a point when you were transitioning into a new career. It sounds a little bit paradoxical, but it was almost like the goal-orientated investment habits, which we're going to talk about today, that you developed during that time, was almost like the beginning of the commencement of your new career, and helped you leverage time to create a life for yourself. So, can you tell us a little bit about your background and where you grew
sure,
up and how you made your way to Australia?
sure, Hayden. And as Dane said, in a way, pleasure to be here and thank you for having us. My journey to Australia was 20 years ago. I moved to Australia from India, having lived in different places around the world, having been, I was lucky enough to have lived in different places around the world whilst growing up. So, India, Dubai, Switzerland, Singapore. And in fact, my goal for coming to Australia at the time was, and I think as you alluded to, goals have always been important to me in my life, and I've lived my life by having goals and milestones along the way. And the goal at that time was to actually go to a country where I didn't know anyone. Interestingly, it was so I opened the map of the world one day, spoke to my parents, and I said, "Where do we not know anyone?" Because we were as a sort of family, we kind of have we know people all around the world, and they said two choices: you have Australia and you have, let's say, Canada. That made the choice very easy. Of course, I'm coming to Australia. Who's going to go to the Canadian winter? Who's going to bear the Canadian winter? So I said Australia it is, and I enrolled myself at a master's program at UNSW just to kind of make my transition into Australia, understand the Australian sort of landscape, the Australian environment, and sort of things like that. And from there on began my journey into Australia, and I found myself, and I felt instantly, to be honest, I felt that within a couple of months of landing in Australia, I felt very comfortable. Oh, yeah. So I felt very comfortable instantly, and decided to made up a goal of myself that I wanted to live. I wanted to live in Australia on a sort of a permanent basis, and then went down the typical skilled migrant route to try and forge a life for myself here in Australia.
Were you one of those people that growing up you just had innately good, saving habits? Some siblings are on the flip side of that coin. They love to spend. They're always on afterpay. Like that was my sister, just always asking for money from mum and dad, whereas I was always putting it away into a savings account. Um, were growing up, did you always have those, strong saving habits, or was this something that you kind of, like Dane, which we'll talk about in a moment, kind of had to develop through your own research and reading?
So mine was actually interestingly. So I would say lucky enough to grow up in a sort of a family where money was not really an issue. However, I very quickly realized, for me, the biggest realization growing up around my family and the people I knew at the time, that money by itself was not making anyone happy. So I
Yeah.
kind of actually developed an aversion to kind of speaking too much about money and investing and things like that. In fact, the first book I read was a balance sheet. I would say, like, that's the first book which I read was an annual report. I knew because I was surrounded by financials and money all the time. So in fact, I actually developed an aversion to actually talking anything money related because money was never an issue. It became those things which I thought in my family was one of the reasons why it didn't bring people together. It actually took people away from each other. So mine, yeah, and for me, I developed a very different attitude towards money when I was growing up. For me, it became very clear. Money is just a means to something else, and I started to focus more on what is it that I want to do with my life, because money is fine. It is what it is. If that answers your question in one way.